Norm, I told him already. No, I'm not. Sorry, Yana. I mean,
Good evening. I was wondering where you all are. The answer is you're online. Hello. How you doing? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, you brought the whiskey. Excellent.
I brought it.
Okay. Give one moment. We're just going to get the screen up.
I brought
Right.
PC cups.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Just
Well, I don't know.
one second.
No, they're politically correct, not paper. So they're not, you know, single use. Well, they are single use, but
Everybody says bamboo excuses for forks. You got no points.
While Peter's giving out the whiskey, should we recap what we're up to? I believe we are on page 69, and we've been discussing the question of street minyanim, basically, and balcony minyanim. That's what we were up to. Sorry. And you agree? Okay, glad you agree. So that's what we were discussing. And on page 69, 10, and we were looking at basically it's a big one. Okay. We were looking at the various issues that we have with siruf laminyan, joining people for a minyan. And we looked at, basically, we ended off with last time was looking at the question of, we saw that on the one hand, we need all 10, ideally are supposed to be in the same room. They're supposed to be in the same room, and the Shulchan Aruch has passed it that way, that all 10 people have to be in the same room to make the minyan. But then we'd seen that he'd also brought, the Shulchan Aruch had brought, based on the Rashba in Hilchot Zimun, that even if one person's outside the room, it's enough if they can see in. And the Rashba said that by Zimun, the Shulchan Aruch wanted to apply that to tefillah, to say that even if they're not all in the same room, as long as they can see each other, and bottom line, as long as the chazan can see all of them, and they can all see the chazan, then that would work. However, we saw the Mishnah Berurah said we should only rely on this bishat hadchak, at a time of great need. That's what we said last time. 1 second, and then we saw, so Mishnah Berurah said only a time of great need because the Rashba had only said it in Hilchot Zimun, that if you're zimunim in 2 rooms and you see each other, then you can join for a zimun, for benching. But who says that's supposed to be applied to tefillah for a minyan as well, when we spoke about the idea of being an entity of 10 people representing the community of Am Yisrael? Maybe that doesn't apply. So Mishnah Berurah said only to do it b'shat hadchak, a time of great need. And we saw the chida, the shita of the chida, right, about those quarantine hotels that they had in Italy, and the chida relied on it in shat hadchak, a time of great need, and that was perhaps precedent for the whole COVID minyanim. And then today we're going to start by talking about another issue to do with Reshut HaRabim. I can see Jeff's here. I can't see anyone else from the area of committee here. We're talking about issues of Reshut HaRabim as well. Might be another issue, which we'll talk about in a moment. Yes, question.
If you, one of the requirements is if you can see the person, then you can see each other. So if you're in the same room, but you're in a room which has got like half partitions, like desks and stuff, so you're blocked off, but you're all in the same room. So it's all one big open space, but in between you there's the division, and you can't see each other. Does that then qualify as being in the same room because you can't see each other?
Okay, interesting question. There's 2 separate issues here. I'll give you another example. L-shaped room.
Yeah, like this room.
An L-shaped room.
Yeah, like this room. So when
Okay.
that partition is open.
If the chazan, if you have an L-shaped room and the chazan is there, and then the other people, so if they're in the same halachic room, then it doesn't matter if they can see the chazan because they're in the same room. The room is what unites them. Question is, when you have all these fancy archways and doors and half open things, that might, under certain circumstances, say, well, this is a separate room, like a division. Like this is not. This is not. There's no. It's right, floor to ceiling open. It's not a doorway. But let's say you had a lounge which split into a dining room, and then you had half and half. That might perhaps be preferable that they're all in the same room, as opposed to half in, half out, even though you've got the big doors open or whatever it is, unless you treat it as one room.
So if you go to like some say go to Prague, if you go to Altnoy, like the
Altnoy Shul in Prague. Okay, yeah, I'll just okay.
You go to the Rabbin machine. Like there's a 1 foot. The wall is about a foot thick, and the and there's a slit, like one of those slits that shoot arrows through.
As often, if you go to any of the Hasidic shuls, they also look like that.
Yeah, if you go. To,
I call it like they have the slits, right, for shooting arrows out of the women's section. It's terrible.
Yeah.
Poor women, they can't see.
Or
It's,
if you go down.
but the best bit is if you go to the Belz Beit Midrash. Have anyone been to the Belz Beit Midrash in Yerushalayim? Have you ever been? So, sorry, basically what they do is great because what do they do? Because if you have these very frum, I say frum, machitzas, they look like that. They say you can only shoot arrows out of. So what they do is, how do you throw sweets? How do you throw lollies? So they have doors. It's brilliant. And I went there once to the big Belz shul in Yerushalayim. Doors in the mechitza, little like windows. They open the window and you see the hand throw them out and they shut the door again. It is like literally like someone's invading. They're throwing things out. It's ridiculous. But so okay, okay. We don't have that in our shul. We think it's important that the women should also feel involved there. That filler as well. Okay. Okay, but so if it's a separate room, then there's really what to discuss. But we don't forget. But in answer to your question about we talking about Prague, Alt Neuschul, that's what you were discussing. So regarding that, we already said though, if there's already 10 in the main room, then it's still considered to fill up a tzibur. So even if the women are higher up, even if you don't want to rely on the chida, and we do rely on him at times of need, like COVID and stuff, even if you don't want to rely on the chida, nonetheless, once there's 10 people downstairs, then everyone who sees and hears joins the minyan, even from upstairs. So it's 100% Philip Tzibur, women are 100% participating in the minyan once there's. The question is if the first 10 have to be in one space. So we discussed, so there's the Chida who says as long as they can see each other, even if at different levels, and the Mishnah Berurah says we should only rely on this at time of need, because it's not so clear that the Rashba should be applied from Zimun to Minyan. Another issue is, as I said Eira before, is the question of Reshut Harabim, and that's paskend in the Shulchan Aruch based on the Shita of Rabbeinu Yonah, and he says as follows here on page 69, source 9. The Shulchan Aruch says as follows in source 9: Yesh mi she'omer, there are those who say, namely Rabbeinu Yonah, she'im Reshut Harabim mafseket ben shnei habatim, if the public road, public thoroughfare, Reshut Harabim, separates between two houses, einam mitzdarfim b'shum inyan, they cannot join together. So even if we were to be somech, we were to rely on the Shulchan Aruch and the Chida, that as long as you can see each other, it's good enough. According to this, it wouldn't help if they are on two sides of the road. So if 5 of us are on one side of the Labasa and the other 5 are on the other side of the Labasa, according to this, it would not help. Now, I mentioned Erevin because the question. Yesh Misha Omer. The problem is when he says Yesh Misha Omer and doesn't actually say stam and Yesh Misha Omer, he doesn't have a stam there necessarily. He adds it as an additional thing. So the question is, does he really hold it? The problem is the Achronim bring it. But before I do, when it comes, this is why I mentioned Erev, because obviously we know the term Reshut Harabim from Erevin. And one of the primary halachot when you learn Hilcha Erevin is that there are many things that has to be in order to constitute Reshut Harabim D'Oraita, a public thoroughfare from the Torah. And one of them is that it's supposed to be Tet Zayin Amma, 16 amot wide. In order for the road, sorry, what is that? Reshut Harabim in Hilchot Shabbat, for Hilchot Hotzah, for carrying. In order for it to be Reshut Harabim D'Oraita, there are many requirements. Not to be Mokora, it's not supposed to have not supposed to be roofed, and it's supposed to be, and as Aaron's complicated, and then there's Ramesh Feinstein complicated things as well by saying that any road that opens onto which could be used by the rabbin also as Reshut Harabim. So like New York basically is the whole thing, New York, Manhattan. Sorry. Right, so the question of mafulash, does it have to be 100 from beginning to end or not? And there's a machloket. What if it's mafulash, meaning it's a thoroughfare, goes from one end to the other, but it's not straight. It's like round. It goes round a bend. Then then that's also so it's a problem. So there's lots to discuss here, but the point is that you might think that would help us out. That, okay, say that, but a lot of roads are narrower. They're not Tet Zayin Amma. Some of the roads here are quite wide, like Balaklava is very wide. It's easily Tet Zayin Amma. It's so then okay, maybe you wouldn't be able to have a minyan across Balaklava. But what about a smaller one of the side streets, which is not Tet Zayin Amma from one end to the other? So then it wouldn't be a Reshut Harabim. The problem is the Taz said this requirement of Tet Zayin Amma, 16 Amot, to be considered Reshut Harabim, that only applies. By the way, if it's not, it's a Karmelit. So it's a Reshut Harabim Rabbanan, just to make that clear. But the Taz says this idea of Tet Zayin Amma, that's only Hilchot Shabbat. When it comes to a minyan, even a smaller thoroughfare would still constitute a gap, a separation between two sides of the minyan. So even if you were to measure Labasa and say actually it's less than 8 meters from one side to the other, Tet Zayin Amma, let's say 10 meters, say 8 meters. Even if you were to say that, that's not good enough according to the Taz, because the Taz here says that that requirement is only for Eruv, for Shabbos, but not for carrying on Shabbos, or Hotzah, the Isra of carrying on Shabbos, but not for our intents and purposes. For a minyan, any road, however narrow, any pathway could act as a gap. So 5 on each side would not help, even if it's a narrow road. So let's see that over the page. The Mishnah Berurah cites him in source 10, top of page 70. He quotes the Taz. It says as follows in source 10. Reshut Harabim, says the Mishnah Berurah in source 10. Katav HaTaz, the Taz wrote, Lav dafka Reshut Harabim mamash shu rachav tet zayin. It doesn't actually have to be 16 amat wide like in Hilchot Shabbat, right? To come off tet zayin, other commas in the wrong place. Rachav tet zayin amot. The huadin, because the same is true. Even if you have just a private pathway, a privately owned pathway, an individual going through the minyan, that would also, according to the Mishnah Berurah and the Taz, count as a gap. And it might need to be a permanent pathway even during the rainy season, i.e., permanently, basically. That it's not just like a pathway was open up part of the year, depending on the seasons, you cut through the field and sunny versus rainy, but rather it's got to be a permanent pathway, maybe. But nonetheless, that those leniencies about defining Reshut Harabim from Shabbat are not applied to Tziruf LeMinyan, to joining a minyan. And therefore, 5 and 5 over a pathway, it seems, according to the Taz, would be an issue, which would mean that you could, according to this, it would seem, and again, we're going to clarify, and don't worry, there's Heterim, we'll discuss, but according to this, it would seem that davening from one side of the road to the other would not join unless you have 10 on one side of the road. You couldn't have 5 and 5 or 9 and 1.
How do you go from our initial problem with Reshut Harabim to just a shvil, to a path, not a kishir?
It's based on the terminology of Rabbeinu Yonah. Question is, when this Shulchan Aruch is based on Psak of Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah said a gap. Now, Reshut Harabim by Shabbos, I understand that. Reshut Harabim for Shabbos really means a public thoroughfare. Here, when the Shulchan Aruch says it, quoting Rabbeinu Yonah, he means a public walkway. The whole point is, unlike Shabbos, where you're actually going from private to public domain, what matters is how big or how small it is. That's not what I'm interested in here. What I'm interested in here is the not the size of the pathway, but the fact there is a pathway. A minyan is supposed to be a unit. We spoke the whole time. We read with Soloveitchik last time about the essence of a minyan is a unit of 10 people who represent Am Yisrael, Kehillah, right? Literally a community coming together, and having any sort of break in between would be an issue. And therefore, even if we were to accept the chidah, that it doesn't matter if you're in one room, nonetheless, there's still another issue here if you're going over some sort of road. And we're going to see the machlok and the poskim as to how far we take a road, or how far, what we can do with that, and how we could or could not be lenient. Yes.
And then 5 on this side, 5 on that side. What if you have the situation, because it's a narrow road that is very rarely used, but it's still a road, but it doesn't get driven over that much. So you've got 4 standing there, and 2 standing in the middle. So there actually is it's not the road, while the road is road, it's still people standing there apart, and it's like a connection between the two.
But then you're already assuming, for example, let's say on Shabbat, and if you're living in a religious neighborhood or a yeshuv in Israel, where the roads are closed, so maybe there's more reason to be lenient. But the problem is, the fact that it is a public road, people will walk up and down through davening. It's not closed off. That's not a unit of tefillah. That seems to be what the defining factor is. Is it a unit of tefillah? And therefore, even for a narrow road, okay. So, but people really take this idea that even if it's not a road, any sort of pathway, right? The Minchas Yitzchak here talks about davening in a park, right? Anyone been to what's it called? Green Meadows? Is it Green Meadows Park? So you have these grass, and then you have the where you can walk. This grass you're allowed to let your dog off the leash, and this grass you're not, right? It's very strict, right? Here you can let your dog off the leash, and on this side of Green Meadows Park you're not. And there's little pitsy little paths about this wide, right? In between. According to Mincha Yitzchak, that path would also be an issue. If 5 of us want one grass and 5 on the other grass, that would be no good. Even a footpath like that would consider the Hesek that because people walk up and down that way, even if they're not walking there right now. Let's see the Mincha Yitzchak inside. It's source 11. He says, "Ba'anashim hamitpalim b'kayitz mincha umayir b'sadeh." People who daven out in the field mincha umayir in the summer. Kama yecholim liot rechakim zeh mizeh b'shetach? How far apart can they be? Shecholim letzarfam leminyan to join a minyan. So he talks about this and he says there after the 3 dots in source 11. Ulam, however, ladati, in my opinion, yesh li zeher, you have to be careful. The chama pa'amim, because sometimes hamitpalim b'sadeh, people daven outdoors. Right, when you go to get fresh air, when you go out to the countryside, shachiach, or you go to Green Meadows Park, right? Shachiach, it's common. There's a walking path along the way, right? And in order not to be in the way of the path, what do people do? They join, they go to either side in the grass. Some on one side, and some people on the other side of the path. There's a little path in between. In that case, that's a problem, says in Yitzchak, they would not join. Like we learned regarding Zimun, and also the Yeshem Yesh Bisha which we saw the Mishnah Berurah, the Shulchan Aruch had applied also to Tefillah. So he doesn't like it there, and he's machmir. He says any sort of pathway.
Am I right to assume that these examples of rains are not in a situation of COVID? We're talking a normal situation.
Correct. You're talking about the normal situation. Now the question is, are there factors and reasons to be lenient during the time of COVID as to how far we take these issues? Again, anyway, we said we're being lenient to rely on the chidah, that even if you're not in the same room, it's outside, inside, from one balcony to the other, whatever it is. The question is, what about this extra issue of pathway or a road in between from one side to the other? And that's what we're dealing with and how we'd apply that. So the Mincha Ashir here, Rav Asher Weiss discusses it in his Tzurba. I learned this actually, the Tzurba itself inside. So it's nice to see them quoting it here, because I know I learned this with a few younger guys here over the summer. And so in source 12 here, on page 71, the Mincha Asher of Asher Weiss discusses the Shaila. And the question is, how far can you be lenient? And he says as follows here. He says, B'sheilat Rabim, regarding the question many people have asked him, corona, right, because of coronavirus, and the serious concern of infection, with filat hatzivur b'batei knesiyot, of davening in shul, can neighbors daven on their balconies and their gardens, basically, or the courtyards, or join a minyan, when they see each other? Can we do this? And this is what he discusses there. And he says there in the second paragraph, Hine, behold, it's clarified in the Shulchan Aruch Chaim as follows. And that's the leniency we saw that Shulchan Aruch had said that somebody who's standing behind the shul, as long as they can see in, we said, is okay. And the Mishnah Berurah said to only rely on that at a time of need. What? Right. But he says, this is clearly paskat in the Shulchan Aruch, absolutely, unequivocally. He disagrees with those who say you should not really rely on this. I.e., the Mishnah Berurah said, best to be machmir, right? He says the Shulchan Aruch himself had paskat it for sure, that if you can see each other, that's enough. But when we see it's explicitly paskat by the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah never disagreed. The Hataz Magen Avraham Tomchim Biado, and the Taz Magen Avraham also support him. Hacholek Aleihem, if you want to disagree with them, Kacholek al Shechina. It's like you're arguing against the Shechina itself. That's pretty heavy, right? Don't be too machmir. The Ein Mashkichim Bo, right? And you shouldn't listen to a person like that. Befrat Shekach Gam Pri Chadash, especially because that's also the opinion of the Pri Chadash and Pri Magadim, the Mishnah Berurah. And we said the Mishnah Berurah had said to rely on it b'shat chak, and therefore he says that after the next 3 dots, there's self-devar at the end of the matter. Bottom line, kiven sheb'shat chak askin, and since in COVID we're dealing with time of great need, yesh lehorot af lechatchila she'efshar letzaref minyan asara derech chatzirot u'mirpasot. You can even lechatchila instruct people that they can make minyanim via courtyards and balconies, ka'asher ro'im b'shomim eiled, as long as they can see and hear each other. Okay. that was okay. But the question is now, what about the second factor that we learned about today, namely the shvil, the pathways and the roads? So this is the other question. So he says, the last paragraph there on page 71. However, nish'alti mirav echad. I was asked by one rabbi, what about if you have balconies on two sides of an entrance to the building? And the stairwell is in between. So you have the building split, the apartments on each side, and the stairwell in between. And the question is, can their balcony seize their balcony? There's a path and a stairwell in between. Can you combine them together even in that case? Well, and it would seem, yesh ladun, that you should have discussed the halol lahedya katav machaber. The Shulchan Aruch wrote, as we saw, it's an issue, right? Based on the Rabbeinu Yonah. The yesh yomer, there are those that say, namely Rabbeinu Yonah, the im derech harabim mafseket bein shnei habatim, that if a public way goes through, ein mitztarfim, they can't join from one to the other. So the question is, does a stairwell also count like a pathway, like the stairwell or the pathway into the building? He says, therefore we have to consider our case, if, over the page 72, if the staircase, is a staircase a public staircase, because it's obviously, it's not public, but it's owned, the building, belongs to multiple people, does that also count? So he says, we saw the Taz was machmir. However, he says, however, this was still about zimun. We didn't actually find that the poskim discuss it about davening. The kol ro'in zeh mistarfin, that those, if they see each other, they can join. Shechalku im yesh reshut harabim benehem, although that they never discussed whether or not they basically they're allowed to do it if there's a public thoroughfare or a pathway in between or not. The Yeterim is there's never actually discussed overtly, despite what we saw in the Taz. It's never explicitly applied in the Shulchan Aruch it's never explicitly applied to tefillah. It is by zim. He says the Yeterim are more than this. Mashma b'divrei machzik bracha. The machzik bracha seems to imply that afim yeshut harabi v'elem mitztarfim. Even if there's actually a full public thoroughfare, a massive road like Balaklava, nonetheless it's good. In other words, not everyone accepts the Rabbeinu Yonah. In addition, he says, the last paragraph in there, but nevertheless, Lemaisa, practically speaking, lo mil ani libi lahakel, I'm not so sure in my heart to be lenient, starfu, that they should actually join for a minion from one side of the pathway to another. Afim yesh beinehem reshut harabim, even if there's a public thoroughfare. Because if we've learned this from Zimun, this is a halachic principle that it's enough just to learn from the thing that you're learning out from. Meaning, if we learned from Zimun in the first place that you're able to join even if you can't see each other, right? Certainly the laws of Zimun would also apply to tell us that's only if there's no pathway. You can't pick and choose what you're learning from Zimun. Either you learn the whole thing from the laws of Zimun or none of it. But once you've learned from Zimun that you can join if you see each other, you have to also accept from Zimun that it's if there's no pathway in between. But if it's not like a public pathway, but a private pathway, like just going into their building or the stairwell for their building, then you can be lenient. Because even regarding Zimun, it's a chiddush of the Taz. It's not necessarily accepted by everyone. If it's just a small passageway or a playground or play area, which only serves the people who live in that building, but not the public, can be more lenient. So it doesn't count as a chotset, as a chatzitza separation. So in other words, the Minchas Asher of Osher Weiss says that even if it will apply to pathways, it certainly wouldn't apply to a private pathway which only serves the people who live in that building. So from, let's say, one set of balconies to the other set of balconies, and there's a pathway in between, that's fine. We're talking here about public pathways. So that's already leniency number one.
Did we use that building go to like there's a thoroughfare between one street and another street because it houses on it through Mayfield and Rockford, and they go through this thing. There is a gate that can close it off, and there's also so much as private property. The fact that someone chooses to go through that doesn't really make it an official thoroughfare. So as it's private property amongst the owners of that block, they should be able to use that still regardless of being an access point between two streets?
I don't think the fact that people decide to walk through a private building and use it necessarily makes it a public thoroughfare. Certainly not for this regard. Yeah.
What does Ro'im ZFZ mean exactly?
Means that they can see each other. Means
But you mean you have to see all other
so
nine
the poskim discussed this, which we haven't really raised just yet, but just to give you bottom line, ideally they should all see each other, but it's enough that they all see the chazan. The chazan has to be able to see all of them.
So you need to have
So the chazan always has to be somebody in the middle in this whole. Yeah. Okay. So Rav Moshe Weiss was more lenient, and others say that quoting Rav Moshe Sternbach, right, head of the Eida Chareidus, right, in Yerushalayim, Shmuel Eliyahu, the Rabbi of Tzfat, they discuss this as well. But Moshe Sternbach here also accepts it here, but he adds that it's good to stipulate. I'm just going to skip over to page 73. This is Moshe Sternbach, head of the Badatz Eida Chareidus in Yerushalayim. And he says as follows, this is in page 73. I just don't want to read the whole Shayla again and again, so we'll just skip to what he says. He implies there's room to be lenient, but he adds the following. In the second paragraph there on page 73, it begins Umihu. You guys see it? Umihu, however. So he says there's room to be lenient, for sure. But our case is a time of great need because of COVID, and therefore there's room to be lenient. But he says, and this is just to be lenient in general. Yeah, okay. So he says as follows. Mihu, nonetheless, near it seems. The kivan sheharashba gufei lo katav kein era b'derech efshar. Remember, the Rashba is the source for this whole leniency, that as long as you see each other, it's enough in Zimun, right? So since even the Rashba himself only wrote it as an efshar, as a maybe, and furthermore, there are many Rishonim disagree with the Rashba that seeing is enough and you need to be in the same room. Therefore, he says, therefore, it's proper, shehashatz Yosef Tnai, that really when the Shliach Tzibur, even though Mikra Hadin has room to be lenient, he suggests from Moshe Steinbach, you do a Tnai, a special condition, you say Chazar Tashat on Tnai. She'im ein mitzdarfin teit filaton nadava. That you do a Tnai, a special condition. If for whatever reason halacha is not like this and it's not good, then my repetition should not be a repetition, but rather should be a tefillat nadava, a voluntary tefillah. And that way, just in case, to cover your bases, it shouldn't be a bracha levatala, a bracha in vain, that you've said chazar tashatz, repetition and unnecessarily. So he says this as an extra reason to be machmir. This is talking about just going from one balcony to the other. What about a street, which is another reason to be machmir? He says the last paragraph there. What about in the case we have a pathway which is in between houses or a road? Near it seems the there's room to in this time of great need of COVID, you can be lenient in time of great need that they do join across a pathway. So he says only if they're in balconies which are higher than 10 tefachim. Why? This goes back again to Hilchos Erevin. We have a halacha that there's no reshut harabim above 10 tefachim. Halacha l'Moshe Messina. Above 10 tefachim is not reshut harabim. So you can't say reshut harabim is mafsika benehem, because once you're above, if there are balconies on this side of the street and they join people on the second floor with the other side of the street, you can't. His argument is that it's okay because that's not a reshut harabim between, because they're both high up. The guy on the ground floor can't join the ground floor, right?
Everyone's head is above 10 traffic.
Everyone's head, don't go there, but the goof is not. Right. We follow Rosho Varubo. It's not just Rosho. I think so stand up, great. Have everyone stand up. If you're already going to that effort, you can probably just cross the road. If you're legally allowed to. I don't know how strict it was here. If you're legal, no.
This isn't about the tonight. It's a tefillat midava. Okay, so if it is, if I only make note, in case we can't really, in case we can't do this, this is a tefillat midava. So if it is true that this is a tefillat midava, what happens to the people who are saying kedusha?
So kedusha is an interesting question we haven't dealt with yet. End of the day, kedusha is not the worst thing. The end of the day is psukim. Oh yeah, there is psukim. They're not all psukim. Yimloch is a pasuk. It's a pasuk. Yimloch. It's not from. It is. It's not from. It's from Tilim. You do. You do. Yimloch Hashem l'kach Torah Luka. It's pasuk and end of Tilim Kuf Mem Vav. So yeah. So yeah, you're thinking about the other thing. It's not from Torah and Nevi'im. It's from Tum.
Yeah.
Kadosh and both and Nevi'im, but right. Okay, that's the whole question about whether you can say Yimloch if you said the first Yihul Ratzon, but you haven't said the second Yihul Ratzon. So most people say you can say Kadosh and Baruch Kavod, but you can't say Yimloch because it's only from Ketuvim and not from Nevi'im. But that's minor. That's a question maybe of Baruch Hu answering Baruch Hashem Baruch. That's more of a question. But here it's just to cover your bases, an extra thing. But so right, Mikar Hadin has room to be lenient, but over a road, he says it's an issue unless you're high up. That's his innovation. Rav Ramon has a very long tshuva on this, he discusses different things. I saw they just brought here a sort of synopsis of various bits as to what you should do in this case across a road. And I can tell you what we did in Al Shvat as well, if it helps. But let's read him in source 14. It says as follows. This is Rav Ramon's tshuva that he wrote on davening during COVID. In source 14, he says, Tefillah b'midrachot. So davening on the midracha, on the pavement. You say pavement here or sidewalk? Pavement, Baruch Hashem. Okay, pavement. Footpath. Okay, you know what I mean. Yeah. So what if you're davening all on the? That's where we were davening. We davened before we came here. We're davening on outside. Im yesh asara sheroim zeh et zeh. If there are 10 who can see each other, or lefachot asara sheroim et hashat. So at least 10 can see the chazan. Nitan li'itpalel hakol karagil. Then you can daven everything normally. Kolel chazarat hashatz, including the repetition of the Amida, ukriyat Torah, and including laning, ubirka kohanim and duchening, which obviously in Israel we do every day. Gam im yeshno kvish ha'over ben shtei hakvutzot. Even if there's a road going across, and we did this in my road in Alon Shvut, not Rav Ramon's road, different road, but we did this in my road in Alon Shvut. We davened across the road. But what's the reason to be lenient? We're going from one side of the road to the other. We could be lenient because where were we davening? We weren't davening in our front gardens. We were davening on the pavement, outside our houses, not in our houses, looking on our gardens. We were on the street. Right. Kivan shekulam ba'ota reshut. Since we're all in the same domain, reshut harabim, the public domain. And therefore, ein kan hefsek klal. In other words, if we were all staying in our houses or in our balconies, like we were at the very beginning of COVID, or we weren't even allowed to step out the front door, then that would be an issue to go over the road. But if we're all just coming out of our houses and we were allowed to do a minyan, but just for safety, we wanted to daven outdoors. So if we were actually standing on the street, us on this side, on the path, this footpath, and the other side of the street on the other footpath, the footpath is also part of the Reshut Harabim. Reshut Harabim is not just where the cars are, it's also where you walk, where people walk, pedestrians walk. And therefore you're all in the Reshut Harabim, right? So I'm saying that even if Labasa were an issue, if you had 5 and 5, as long as 5, well, they weren't in the driveways, but they took one step forward and they were on the road. I don't know if the police come, you take one step back again. I don't know what the rules are, but I'm saying if you're on the path, on the pavement, on the pathway, then that is the same Reshut. Then you're all in the Reshut Harabim. And therefore, ein kan hefsek klal. That will not be a hefsek at all, separation at all. Especially when there's no cars coming past. And therefore a person could even, and you could also stand on the street if there were no cars, then all the more so it's better. So to go back to what you're saying. But the idea is that so even if we are machmir, once you're on the pathway, the public footpath, that's part of the street anyway. And therefore you're all in the Reshut Harabim to begin with.
Once there's an Eruv though.
Don't ask.
All moved.
Right, so this is the
If you're
question.
in the
Oh,
same-
there's an Eruv. We were married with the Eruv. What's the problem? We already saw the Taz. The
Yeah.
Taz says that an Eruv, what does an Eruv do? The Eruv says it makes it one Reshut.
Yeah.
Okay. But we said that the parameters of the Eruv isn't what was important. Because even if it's less than Tet Zayin Amr, it's only a Kamrit, right? But nonetheless, what matters is if it's Shaykh to the Rabbim. You're going to say through the Eruv, is everything Shaykh to everyone.
Yeah.
But not for this. The point is you need a private space. That's the idea. So an Eruv wouldn't help you here. Though I thought about that. Though.
But like here, what happens during last year, so for the Amin Maraim, we weren't allowed outside. You weren't allowed to have, you weren't allowed to street in the Amin. No, not the Amin Maraim. Only
was-
for,
They want something.
oh,
I
that
didn't
was-
go, but that was the case.
that was illegal.
Well,
Um,
Hollywood, but they had it.
But for Sukkot already, I think,
The
definitely
support
Sukkot.
was allowed, no, I remember the support was allowed, so I mean, we had in our.
Yeah, Sukkot was definitely there.
Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh
Labasa
Hashanah was-
had, maybe it was, maybe.
No, they weren't, because they were standing in their front yards. They weren't in the streets.
Is that what's the so what's
They
the,
weren't in
what's
their
the
front
question?
yards. So, because according to Rabbi Rimon, you have to be standing on the footpath.
Yeah.
So we weren't standing on our footpaths. We were standing in our front yards.
So if you weren't, so that would not be
ideal.
ideal. That what we
Yeah.
just learned, that was not ideal.
Yeah.
That was
Because
not
there were
ideal.
people who were standing-
But the question is if there's room to be. Well, I mean, Reverend Mont, they didn't
because
quote.
the police came by
they didn't
and
quote
there
the
were
whole
people
chut- they
on the
didn't quote-
footpath, and they said, "What are you doing?"
Correct. They
And
didn't
we were
quote.
laying on the footpath.
Okay, so they didn't quote the whole tshuva here. They didn't quote the whole tshuva here. He goes on and says that if you have to be somewhere to do across the footpath, I remember Reverend Mont's tshuva. They just quote a piece. Then if you have to rely on it in COVID, and certainly he didn't quote Melbourne, but certainly under the situation in Melbourne at the time, then to do it, but maybe to do it with under certain restrictions, maybe to do a tanai for shots and things like that. That I've got the full tshuva. They only printed this bit in the book. But there's a full. So chas v'shalom, there should not be another lockdown, and chas v'shalom, God forbid, there should not be another lockdown. Certainly not Rosh Hashanah, and if there is, I have the tshuva, and I'll help out. Okay. All right. But it won't be relevant, please God. There are those, however, who don't like this leniency of going across the road in any form. And Rav Shechter, Rav Hershel Shechter from obviously from YU, is among those who has difficulty with the whole leniency to begin with, of joining in these fashions via balconies, across roads, etc. And let's see what he says in source 15. So this is page 74, source 15. This is the tshuva by Rav Shechter, really going through all sort of the modern day poskim today. And he says as follows, this is source 15. It says Rav Shechter, each person is davening by themselves on their balcony. And they're all the balconies are close to one another. But in a way that they can see each other. There are those that wanted to say, as we've just read, many poskim in fact, they do join to 10. Just like the Mishnah Berurah, who shares Sikh, had concluded, that at a time of great need, you could be lenient. Right, you could. It's possible to be lenient, as we see in the whole Mishnah Berurah says, only to rely on this time of great need. And as we know, this is all based on the psak of the Chida. Remember, what was the Chida's thing? We think 2 weeks of quarantine is bad. They used to have 40 days of quarantine of ISO to get into Italy, right? And therefore, so that they shouldn't be out a million for 40 days. That's why the Chida was lenient in these sort of quarantine facilities that they had at the Chida's time to enter Italy. Therefore, says Rav Shechter, the second paragraph, Achen, however, kulazo kashama od. This leniency is very difficult. Because everything relies on the din in brachot, le'inyan zimun, regarding zimun. And don't forget, this all started with zimun, and the Rashba was in doubt as to whether to apply it from zimun to davening, to dvarim shebekdusha. But Gemara mashma, from the simple understanding of all the Gemara, it's implied. Really, it seems from the Gemara and the other sources, they all need to be in one room. The only leniency for 10 for the zimun is because zimun is not necessarily a davar shebekdusha. Discussion for another time, and therefore he doesn't like it. These minyanim, even with the leniency, even if they're on the same side of the road, it's not ideal. And Rav Yitzchak Yosef wrote similar tshuva, similar reservations regarding these sort of minyanim. And he says, and I'm going to read down 16 in this second paragraph in source 16, just time. So this last paragraph on page 74. But davar tziruf leminyan, this is Rav Yitzchak Yosef. But davar tziruf leminyan b'reshut chalukot, regarding joining together for a minyan in different places, could go and become a mirpesot, like on several balconies, or chatzerot batim, or several front yards, the chadoma and the like. but often in the way shekol reshut yesh pachot minyan. Each place has less than a minyan. Over tziruf kulam yesh minyan shel asara nashim, and only together do you have 10 people. Lemaisa, practically speaking, ein lismoch al ze klal le'inyan tziruf leminyan. So Rav Yitzchak Yosef also says you should not rely on it at all. It's quite a strong language he uses. You should not rely on it at all. Ve'ein la'asot chazara l'hotzi sefer Torah, and therefore you should not do repetition of the Amida or to lane or levarach brukah kohanim or to duchun. Ki pashut yesh kan chashash shel kama brachot levatala. There's a serious concern here of making brachot in vain. V'chein datam shel rov kol poskim hasfardim v'gam Ashkenazim. He says that many of them, almost all the poskim hold this way. So we've seen, even though there were many who were lenient, Rav Yitzchak Yosef was machmir, and Rav Shechter also had reservations. That's even on one side of the road, because they're not on one reshut.
Didn't you read before that the said that you can?
So we have, how could it be? How could it be Rav Yitzchak Yosef? It's not possible like Mechaber, because he's not Rav Avadia Yosef. He's only Rav Yitzchak Yosef. So he's not as militant. He's not as Rav Yitzchak Yosef's not as militant about it as his father. I mean, he's pretty hardcore in terms of this is Maran's Pasak, that's Maran's Pasak, but here he doesn't do that. Correct. Certainly when it's Lakula, to be a leniency against the majority of the Rishonim, and the only person the Beit Yosef was really relying on was an Efshar in the Rashba. So to apply it from Zimran to davening. So, but there are those who sort of take a middle ground. Quotes here of Shlomo Miller from Chicago. Toronto. Yeah, sorry, I meant Toronto. I meant Canada. That was where beginning with C. Too late at night. Yes, Toronto. I'm based in Toronto. And no, not more whiskey. And so he discusses it, and others, and they sort of take a middle ground as to, again, the question of whether you should do Chazar Tashatz or not. And just because of time, I'm not going to read the entire Tshuva inside, because I think we've read the questions again and again, just phrased by different people in different ways. But what he says here in source 17, Shlomo Miller, is as far as we're going to skip. In fact, let's find well, we should skip to. Let me just skip down in. So I just move the Zoom people out of the way. You guys will forgive me. Just move you sideways a little bit. There we go. Okay. Okay. So the second paragraph there on page 75. This is of Miller's Tshuva. It begins Ach. You see it? Ach. It says, however, right? We verify according to the law of the land. Also according to medical guidelines. One who wants to do a minyan on the balcony can do so, as long as there's social distancing. However, dafka is specifically make sure that you're keeping the law. He was very insistent you keep the law and you stand on your own balcony. Not to gather together with anyone else, not from your house at all. Right? Not to let anyone else from outside come and join the minyan if it's illegal, basically. If they don't keep the law, if they see, this is very strong words, but this is based in Toronto. Even if you see that people are making fun of light of the restrictions, then just simply to say there should not be no minyanim at all. They should all be banned to ensure to save life. But his chumrah is as follows, and he says, besides for his chumrah is for ensuring that we're safe on machmir for the kuach nefesh, for their life, he gives the following chumrah in the last paragraph there. Gam ledati lahachmir kedat av beit din bnei brak, right? Harav Sherach Rosenblatt. So he also wants to pass like Rosenblatt. She'ein la'asot shum chazarat hashatz or kriyat haTorah or shar bracha tzricha minyan. Even though he says you should daven with the minyan, he says you should not do laning, you should not do repetition of the Amida or any other brachot which require a minyan. Again, because he's a middle ground, he's concerned for bracha levatala. We'll see. Kivan sheyesh plug to imit starfim al yedei re'iyah b'ufat. Since it would be a bracha, right? Says it right because there's a machloket about it. Then Ken, if so, yesh safek bracha levatala. It's a safek, maybe a bracha bain. Rak yitztarfu li'yan kaddish kedusha. Only for kaddish and kedusha we should join. And therefore, nachon sheyitztarfu minyanim repeset rak lemincha. So you should join for mincha. For well, hit palel mincha katsara. You should do the short mincha. And that way you get out of the whole issue. So he says, make sure you have good mincha minyanim. Baruch Hu might be an issue. Possibly, but he doesn't mention Baruch. Does short mincha would have a kedusha? No, he says kedusha, kaddish and kedusha you can say because there's no bracha in vain. Only repetition would be a bracha in vain, or laning would be a bracha in vain. Kaddish you could say he's lenient for kaddish. He doesn't say explicitly here about Baruch, because it does have Shem Hashem in. So that's the question.
We were doing this for.
You were doing it for a good long 4 months, right?
Well, we had several 4-month lockdowns. So over a 2-year period, this was happening. I don't recall, and maybe because it was new and we didn't have, Rabbanim from Eretz Yisrael or whatever, but I don't remember anyone talking about this and highlighting some of the halachic difficulties. It was almost like a free-for-all. I mean, I participated. I'm not criticizing anybody else, but we did what we did. We got together. This is really the first. I'm sorry?
The only ones they ruled on were the official, in the shorts, in the.
No, within the Dalam, it's right down. Well, to the best of my knowledge, there was none. Were there? I can tell you that in our street.
We built from Mizrahi, there was no. There was no permission there.
Okay. All right.
What I'm saying is, forget.
I
What I'm saying
hear what you're
is,
saying.
the mice, right? There were street minyanim, predominant. I went to one, predominantly made up of Balabatim from Israel. Okay, so forget permission. That was a mitzvah. That's what was going on. I'm not criticizing. I'm just making an observation. Not in the first, in the second for sure. No, what I'm saying to you is I don't recall, right, anybody highlighting some of these halakhic issues during that period. I'm not criticizing, I'm simply making an observation.
I think
I cannot comment on what was done prior to my arrival. Nor many things after my arrival.
It's merely an observation.
But we'll leave. I'm nervous. I'm being recorded.
there were
So,
also
yeah.
differences in the civil law.
Danny's not back yet.
in the regulations.
No, certainly there were.
Okay.
All I'm saying to you is there were periods. I'm talking to myself.
Please address complaints to
We don't have-
Mizrahi office. And if you have a private shaila, God forbid we go into lockdown, I'm here. I'll help out.
We don't have
Don't worry, I'm
interest
here.
yet, so it's different.
Okay.
Rav Lewis always fill out the apples. It's always doing.
Well, please God, it won't happen again, but I'm sure that we'll be we can reassess, and I can call Rav Ramon as well. Okay. So, all right. So we've seen. Let's move on. I want to just move on because Baruch Hashem, we're going, as we say, li'itenu, at a good pace with all the questions, and obviously there's a lot of sensitivity to these issues. That's good. We're asking questions, but it'd be good to move on a little as well. And just in general, and this was something which was very halacha l'maisa just last week, 2 weeks ago with Purim, which I had to deal with here. I had to deal with the kehillah here, which was, well, can you listen to things? Well, this opens the bigger question about what about digital solutions, like hearing a minyan via Zoom. The whole question of Megillah, for example, Megillah over Zoom. So I know you had slichos on Zoom, but I think there's a difference between hearing slichos on Zoom, which could be done by Yachid, versus question of kosher Megillah reading, which is much more difficult issue. So let's discuss the idea of answering to a minyan, heard over Zoom, heard online, seen or heard online. So do we have any sort of precedent? And that sounds ludicrous. Do we have any sort of precedent? The shul in Alexandria is the precedent that we have in the Gemara, and that we'll look at now in source 19, on page 77, source 19. The Gemara in Sukkah tells us the following: that this massive shul they had in Egypt, in Alexandria. Tanya Rebbe Yehuda, Rebbe Yehuda says, we learn it right. Mi shelo ra'a de'elofsoton shel Alexandria shel Mitzrayim. Anyone who did not see the great synagogue of Alexandria in Egypt, lo ra'a bichvodon shel Yisrael, never saw the glory of Israel. Amru, they said about it that it was kamin basiliki gedola. It's like a massive basilica, right? It was huge, like a palace. Haita, right? Haita stav lifnim mistav. It was like row of column after row of column. Pa'amim shahayu ba shishim ribo al shishim ribo. Kiflaim kiyotzem Mitzrayim. Times there were 600,000, then another 600,000, double the amount of people who left Egypt. In other words, it was a massive shul. Ubima shel eitz be'emtzeita. They had a massive bima, a bima of wood in the middle. V'chazan ha'knesset omed aleh, and the chazan would daven on it. V'hasudarim biyado. This is brilliant, right? So the chazan would be on it, or the conductor, or whatever, the gabbai, and he had sudarin. He had a sudar, like a kinyan sudar, scarves. He had scarves in his hand, because it was such a massive shul, you couldn't hear. Just like our marquee minion out here, right? Sometimes you can't hear because of Baruch Hashem, so many people. The kivan shehigia, and the trams, namely because the trams can't hear. The kivan shehigia la'anot amen. So when the time came that he reached the point where they had to answer amen, hala meinif b'sudar, he would wave his scarf, or the gabbai would wave the scarf. Chol ha'am onim amen, and everyone would answer. So he had this massive shul in Alexandria, and not everyone could hear because it was so big. But they could see. So when he got to a point to answer amen, the gabbai or the chazan, whoever I was referring to, would wave the scarf, and then they would answer amen. So even though they couldn't actually hear it, the signal to know they could answer amen was enough. So this is an interesting precedent, and Moshe Feinstein uses this. And again, he is a dat yachid in many regards to this. He is a lenient or an individual alone position. Regarding, he discussed in his time making Havdalah over the telephone. He talks about here that he was asked about tshuva about an elderly woman who was in hospital by herself, and there was no one for her. She was sick, and there was no one to make Havdalah for her. And he was asked, can they make Havdalah for her over the telephone? And he allowed, in this situation, that there was no one to make Havdalah for her in hospital, that she could hear Havdalah over the telephone and fulfill her obligation over the telephone. And that's what one of the first tshuvot of sort of the late 20th century or mid to late 20th century regarding sort of doing things digitally. And not everyone agreed with him. Really, he got a lot of pushback from this. But this is his tshuva in source 20, the end of page 77. Be'inyan shmiat Havdalah al yedei telephone. Right, spelled the Yiddish way, telephone. Right, hearing Havdalah through the telephone. Le'isha hanimset bebeit hacholim, for a woman who's basically kept in hospital. Hinei, behold, if she's unable to hear Havdalah where she is, in other words, she's not going to hear Havdalah at all, Vadai, for sure, yesh la lishmoa, over the page, she should hear it, meaning she's not going to hear Havdalah anyway, then she should definitely hear it over the page, a la telephone, via the phone, just like I wrote in the Tshuva in Orach Chaim, Gabe creates Megillah, that if that's the only other option, then it's okay, because it's logical that she's more likely to fulfill it than if she doesn't hear Havdalah at all. V'hu adin gabe Havdalah, like he said by Megillah, and the same is true with Havdalah. V'chen, and similarly, sarich la'anot amen al bracha sheshomim al yedei telephone va'al yedei microphone misafek. And in addition, in a general, a person should say amen to a bracha they hear over the phone or via a microphone out of safek. That maybe, in fact, it is a good thing, and therefore you should answer amen. So Rav Moshe Feinstein allowed it, and again, that was a time of great need where she wasn't going to hear Havdalah anyway, but he allowed it. What? Why couldn't she say Havdalah herself? I presume we're talking about, not because of the Kabbalistic reasons, I presume it's because she was unable to, or didn't know, or she was unwell and didn't have the koach to. But of course, that the first order, the first psak would always be that to say Havdalah yourself. Is a woman chayevet in Havdalah? Yes. Well, it depends. According to Rambam, it's because it's part of the mitzvah of Zachar, and therefore, a woman's chayav in kiddush, she also chayav in Havdalah. According to others, it's kind of the Rabbanan.
So was the question was based on the fact that it was being transmitted over a digital device as opposed to being
non-digital.
Electronic.
No, but
Not when he wrote it. Not when he wrote this tune.
regardless, but over electronic devices as opposed to being hearing it face to face. So they want, if someone has a hearing aid, they hear anything through a digital or through an analog or digital device, they go your voice.
What's the difference between what you asked and what we're dealing with? And this is what gets to Rav Shlomo Zalman, who's Cholek, who totally disagrees with Moshe Feinstein in source 21. Shlomo Zalman and Auerbach disagreed. And he said, you can't compare the two. Because the case of a hearing aid is just like Alexandria. He's in the room, you just couldn't hear it. The phone, they're not in the room. They're on the other side of New York, on outside the world. How can you say that you're indicating? So if I press a button now so that my parents in England's light flashes, they can answer amen to my bracha here. That's ludicrous. You can't compare the two. And that's Rav Shlomo Zalman's Auerbach's argument in source 21. Why do you have to be in the room? Because there's two issues here. What? Because the question, well, there's two separate issues here that we're sort of getting conflated or getting mixed up. One is that there's the question of halachically, may I, if I didn't hear the bracha, may I be yotzer through if I know when to answer amen? And the second issue is a digital reconstruction of my voice like my voice? Two separate issues. So with the hearing aid one, correct, it's not my voice, but it's okay because I know when to answer amen. Right? The hearing aid's like the flag being waved. But it's different to, I'm in the room. I'm present. It might be a question, does the hearing aid help for things like hearing an obligation, like hearing Megillah or hearing Havdalah? That might be different. But if it's just a question of when do I need to say amen, then that's for sure. Then that's the issue here, that Rav Moshe Feinstein in his telephone thing is not only saying it's good enough to know, and that's, by the way, at weddings. Like often at weddings, people say amen, that the microphone's there, but you're at the wedding, like you're there. You know he's finishing the bracha. So like there's more room to be lenient when you're in the room. But the question is, can the person who's watching on Zoom from Israel answer amen? They're not there. And it's just, sorry, but he can't see it. He can see a video of it. And if I play that video and as a lag of 30 seconds, can I still answer amen? The lag is also another issue. So this, anyway, we will have to end here, I'm afraid, but we'll discuss with Shlomo Zalman next time at the other poskim and wake up what Rav Moshe said, Rav Moshe Feinstein said, and then Shlomo Zalman disagreed. And we will, Bezrat Hashem, continue next week. So shakoach to you, and yeah, it'll be lovely to see more people in person if you can. Big soon.